Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're jumping right into a highly provocative and, frankly, pretty fascinating geopolitical theory presented by Professor Zhang Shexin. We're going to take a strictly objective look at this massive, incredibly complex blueprint of United States global strategy and how it maintains its empire. Honestly, whether you're a hardcore student of international relations or just someone trying to make sense of the daily global headlines, this analysis offers a radically different lens for viewing current events. Okay, let's dive into this. The central premise of this whole theory is absolutely counterintuitive. It argues that the point isn't to bring peace, but actually to control the choke points to create as much chaos as possible, right? We usually think of nations going to war to secure a decisive traditional victory. But Professor Zhang's theory argues that the real endgame for the U.S. isn't necessarily to win in the conventional sense. Instead, it's to deliberately orchestrate global chaos. Why? Because chaos, when it's managed correctly, literally forces the rest of the world to rely on you. To really wrap our heads around how this works, here's our roadmap for the explainer. First, we'll look at the wartime economy. Second, the 4 strategic pillars. Third, global choke points. Fourth, an Iran case study. And finally, the ultimate long-term prediction for the U.S. empire. Section 1. The wartime economy. Moving to total war. So, according to this analysis, before the U.S. can push its weight around overseas, it has to radically restructure things at home, basically preparing for what the source calls total war. And the projected data really reflects this shift. Right now, the Pentagon budget hovers around the $1 trillion mark, but the theory predicts a massive 50% increase, shooting up to $1.5 trillion, quickly followed by another jump to a staggering $2 trillion. The analysis suggests this insane influx of capital is designed to shift the entire domestic economy toward manufacturing weapons and munitions. It's about building the absolute baseline required to pull off this grand strategy. But, it's not just about the money. It's about manpower. The source points out a pretty startling development. Starting this December, Americans aged 18 to 26 will be automatically registered for the draft. Professor Zhang's analysis interprets this as a major red flag, a clear signal that a national draft is actually imminent, potentially to force young men to fight in the Middle East. He argues this is a key indicator that a true wartime economy is already taking shape. Section 2. The 4 strategic pillars. Divide and conquer. If the U.S. is actually moving to a wartime footing, what exactly is the game plan? Well, the source argues the U.S. is moving away from being bogged down in too many overseas wars. Instead, they're pivoting to a highly focused divide and conquer doctrine, built on 4 main pillars. First up, building the U.S. defense industrial base, basically making America the arsenal of democracy so its factories can crank out all the necessary weapons. Second, increasing burden sharing among allies. Third, deterring China in the Indo-Pacific, but doing it through economic strangulation rather than direct, messy military confrontation. And fourth, enabling key regional allies to challenge Chinese supremacy, creating a very carefully managed balance of power. Now, what's really interesting about this analysis is how it completely redefines the word ally. It argues that under that second pillar, the burden-sharing one, nations like Japan, South Korea, and European NATO members aren't really being treated as friends anymore. Instead, the theory claims they are strictly treated as subordinates. The U.S. essentially just orders them to do whatever is necessary to protect American power. In fact, the source bluntly describes this whole dynamic as a modern form of vassalage. Section 3. Controlling global choke points. The maritime toll dues. So how does the U.S. actually enforce these pillars and keep everyone, allies and adversaries alike, in line? According to the theory, it all comes down to basic geographical mechanics, specifically the strategic choke point. Think of it like a giant global toll booth. The source emphasizes that the United States has the world's greatest blue water navy. Literally, no one else even comes close. By controlling these narrow, vital maritime bottlenecks, the U.S. doesn't even need to occupy massive amounts of land. It just controls the flow of global trade, essentially forcing the rest of the world to depend entirely on American generosity just to survive. And this brilliantly illustrates the strategy in action. Take China's energy reliance, for example. According to the source, a whopping 80% of China's energy needs pass through one single geographic bottleneck, the Strait of Malacca. If the U.S. and its regional allies decide to close off or embargo that strait, they can economically strangle China without ever firing a shot in a direct military conflict. It forces total compliance from a position of absolute, undeniable strength. Section 4. The Iran case study. strategic chaos. Let's apply this whole grand theory of economic strangulation directly to the Middle East. The analysis argues that the current conflict with Iran isn't just some isolated event. It's a core, fundamental part of maintaining the U.S. empire. But here's that paradox we talked about earlier. The goal is not total victory. The U.S. doesn't actually need to completely defeat Iran. It just needs to make sure the region stays in a constant, rolling state of strategic chaos. Because as long as there is war, normal, everyday global trade is disrupted. The source details a pretty grim operational prediction for a potential round 2 of the fighting. Step 1 involves targeting vital civilian infrastructure, things like bridges, universities, and desalination plants. Step 2 is about effectively destroying Iran's capacity to even function as a nation-state. And Step 3 acknowledges the massive blowback. Iranian retaliation could close the Red Sea and target natural gas pipelines. That could literally take a full third of the world's energy supply offline. And the wild part? According to the theory, U.S. national security strategy has already factored this in and fully accepts the resulting global economic depression. So the absolutely crucial question is, why on earth would any nation accept that level of economic destruction? Well, because the chaos serves a very specific strategic purpose. Completely destroying Iran blocks China's Belt and Road Initiative, which heavily relies on Iran as a central hub. It also severely limits Russia's ability to trade oil, basically capping them at maybe 30 to 40% of China's needs. All that remaining energy deficit, it forces the world to buy from the United States. And when you are forced to buy from the U.S., they get to dictate the terms, most importantly, mandating that you trade exclusively in U.S. dollars. And that, the theory argues, is what saves the American economy. Section 5, the long-term prediction, empire in retreat. So where does Professor Zhang Shueqin see this all heading? If this strategy of manufactured chaos and choke point control is fully played out, what's the ultimate fate of the U.S. empire? Well, the theory maps out a very clear chronological timeline. In the short term, America is going to appear to be winning. The strategy of containing those choke points will seem highly, highly effective. But in the medium term, the source predicts that internal corruption, division, and rising nationalism will start to rot the system from the inside out. And in the long term, the prediction is that America will actually lose its empire entirely, being forced to retreat all the way back to the Western Hemisphere, essentially falling back on the old Monroe Doctrine. And a really specific part of this predicted decline involves adversaries eventually pushing back against this maritime dominance. They won't just sit there. The source notes that we're going to start seeing emerging threats where countries like Russia directly challenge American control of these choke points. In fact, the theory points to increased naval activity in places right in America's backyard, like Cuba, as early evidence that this shift is already happening. Which leaves us with this final, genuinely provocative thought to ponder. According to this theory, the United States is playing a massive, high-stakes game of global leverage. But will this strategy of controlling global choke points and managing strategic chaos actually sustain an empire for the foreseeable future? Or is it simply fueling the exact kind of chaos and internal division that will inevitably force its own retreat? It is a fascinating, if somewhat unsettling, framework to keep in mind as we watch global events continue to unfold. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning what you see in the headlines.